I want to welcome everyone to the Passive Seismic series webinar. Today we have Steve Carpenter presenting geophysics role of non-technical issues integral to full-scale CCUS deployment. Today we also have Dave Diller with us. He is the chair of the Passive Seismic Committee at SCG, and he was the one who organized this webinar with Steve. So Dave.
Thank you. So yeah, just a bit about how this webinar came to be, which is that I watched Steve's webinar in the Houston Geophysical Society forum in November, and I was really impressed by both his presentation and my lack of knowledge in this area. And I didn't know a lot of what I've been focused in. My business is microseismic monitoring, and that's our big interest, by the way, Steve, is that at least for some of us, we'd like to monitor. We'd like to be in that business.
Right, agreed.
A lot of other geophysics that may be necessary as well, which I assume you'll be talking about. Dr. Stephen Carpenter is an internationally recognized subject matter expert witness, and transdisciplinary practitioner focusing on the merging of the physical sciences with the social sciences. With 30 plus years of experience in the energy, mining, international, and standards development arenas, he has established himself as an internationally recognized SME on EOR. So you're gonna have to help me out on SME. EOR is Enhanced Oil Recovery.
And SME is subject matter expert.
Okay. Standardization, climate change, carbon, and risk management issues. He is the head of the delegation and chair of the United States Technical Advisory Group for ISO Technical Committee TC82 Mining, TC265, CCUS, that's Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage, TC298 Rare Earths, and TC333 Lithium. Chair of the CSA Group's North American Strategic Steering Committee on Natural Resources, a trustee with the Energy Mineral Law Foundation and International Pittsburgh Coal Conference at Swanson School of Engineering, University of Pittsburgh, and received a lifetime appointment to the Executive Order of the Ohio Commodore. So as impressive as that may be, it's actually a bit understated, I believe, if you look at his LinkedIn page. For example, the Executive Order of the Ohio Commodore is an appointment by the governor of the state, and it's considered Ohio's most distinguished honor. I also have to point out here that Steve is an offensive line coach on a high school state championship football team, which I bet he'd be willing to talk about another time. So with all of that, I hope I've done you justice, Steve. Please take it away.
Best introduction I've ever had. I greatly appreciate it. You embarrassed me by some of the things that are said. They're all true, but greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to turn my camera off so I can stop looking at me while we're having a conversation. Turn it back on when we get to the end. And there are 53 slides. My job, if I do it correctly, this will seem like about 12 minutes and 2 slides. And I'm hoping to have it's unfortunate it will seem like a one-way conversation with you now, but when we get to the question and answers, hopefully we can be more engaging. I'm going to try and set some context to answer some questions of why is this important and how can we get it accomplished? How can we help the Geophysics Society, the geophysics industry, better understand and engage in CCUS, and hopefully provide some opportunities for you all to think about that maybe you haven't. What's on your screen today is a nominal notion that has come out in a variety of places, the IPCC, the US EPA and DOE, some of my work. And I think it's an acknowledgement that what you had said, Dave, is that many times we get lost in the details of our work, that we don't know what's going on in the rest of, in this case, the CCUS industry. And so my job today is to expose you all to some of that. and hopefully provide some insight for opportunities. So I want to try and touch on 4 things: language, transdisciplinarity, environmental social governance, and why they matter. I'm going to talk a little bit about CCUS and CO2 EOR. Don't mean to talk over or under anybody's expertise, but sometimes resetting the context and resetting terms and definitions, excuse me, helps in the latter discussion, so we're all on the same page. And then we'll talk about life cycle assessment and how all this comes together. Language is a unique and interesting thing, and in many cases it presents barriers. And in this case, I'll use an example of a traditional CCUS project where we have a coal-fired electric power plant and an oil field, a CO2 EOR, where the coal plant's going to generate the CO2, transport it, give it to the operator, and they're going to put it in the ground. And everybody looks at each other and talks at, over, and around each other, because in many cases they don't understand each other. An electric power plant talks about things in volts, electrons, kilowatt hours, megawatts, and they're very comfortable with 173 volts of electricity going through a cable that you can't see, but they are petrified of anything underground, because even though they can't see electricity, they're comfortable with it. They don't see what goes on underground, and they have no risk tolerance. They're completely risk averse of putting anything in the ground. Conversely, those of us in the oil and gas industry talk about million barrels, SCIFs, MCFs, CFM, and we're very comfortable in talking about and perceiving and understanding what happens underground where we can't necessarily see it. In some cases, 1 to 2 or greater miles underground. But we can be uncomfortable with dealing with how processes generate electrons, how the issues that electric utilities deal with provide a barrier to us. I'll take it a step further, and I'll talk about, even in our industry, the box in the bottom. Many cases, those in the oil and gas industry say primary, secondary, tertiary. They say enhanced or improved oil recovery, and they mean very different things. And so understanding the context from where we are and where the folks are that are talking to us matters. I also would argue from a purely human comprehension standpoint, I'm assuming we have a few geologists or geology majors in the crowd. You all have a distinct ability to understand things that happen over immense periods of time. The notion that our magnetic poles have flipped north to south and south to north some 11 times in our history. The notion of Pangea and the fact that continents weren't always where they are and attached to different folks, we can comprehend, but most humans have a very difficult time understanding things that don't function in a time frame of our lifetime, that is 100 years or less. Scale matters. For the normal, common, non-technical person, understanding a CO2 molecule and the notion that at the surface to compressing it and putting it at 2.5 kilometers has 3 orders of magnitude changes in its volume. The notion that CO2 can function in a supercritical state that can act as a solid liquid in a gas is a foreign concept. And understanding that how we produce CO2 and how we transport it, whether in pipelines or trucks, matters, because the physics of the CO2 matters. These things are all very difficult for people to grasp, and it becomes very important for how we talk about things, and more importantly, where you all could find niches. We're living in a world that's changing very quickly, obviously because of COVID and now Delta and Omicron and whatever variants come after have created a situation where we're talking today electronically. That's become our normal mainstay. Moving forward, this was written in 2020, but I would say it's very applicable in 2022 and beyond. The ability for us to assess and develop new content in new ways, i.e. webinars and PowerPoints, is important. For us to be able to collaborate this way as opposed to let's have a meeting and go down the hall and sit in the conference room and do things together has changed likely permanently. And all those are wrapped up in a word known as transdisciplinarity, of how is it that we're going to be able to have folks of different literacy and different disciplines come together and talk and accomplish good work. So I want to talk for a minute about transdisciplinarity. A good friend of mine, Tim Carr, was the head. He's retiring as the head of geology at WVU. Dear friend. Tim doesn't believe in transdisciplinarity. He thinks it's hooey. And I have a deep conversation with him and I say, tell me why. And he says, because when I teach and educate geologists, I expect them to be the best geologists they can be. I want them to have a very deep knowledge of geology. I need them to know more about geology than the next geologist to make them better. And I understand that. But in today's world, I argue that not having some breadth, as a geologist working in the oil and gas industry, if you don't have some understanding of economics, you won't be as valuable as a geologist who does. If you're going to work in climate change as a geologist and not have an understanding of public policy, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So there's this notion of balancing depth versus breadth and understanding what some would call this new definition of transdisciplinarity. The bottom, I'm going to read I'll read it and talk about it as you look at the graphics. Transdisciplinary equips researchers to deal with what is known as the dialectic triad. We know thesis. We know when we create an idea. We know antithesis. We know the opposite of that. And we know synthesis. We know those three words. But analogously, from a social science standpoint, you have modernity, you have postmodernity or postmodern, which is where we are now, and transmodern. And the real translation of that is how do we merge, understand disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary? And I argue that CCUS is one of the best issues, topics, research questions, phenomenon to apply it to, because it requires capture, transport, storage, and a whole host of other things to address it. Here's a perfect example of some of those things. Originally, CCS or CCUS was a very disciplinary approach. The chemical engineers dealt with capture, the mechanical and civil engineers dealt with transportation, and the geologists and reservoir engineers dealt with storage. And as this phenomenon grew and changed, and as those spheres merge, you can see in the center that where the Venn diagram crosses, we have new technologies, looking at separation nanotechnologies and bringing the actually manufacture of nano devices and nano shapes applied to capture to get more surface area has been phenomenal. We've got great work done on the transportation side, reservoir characterization, and now on the utilization piece and how we're going to beneficiate that CO2. And you move those spheres even closer together in the green on the right, and you get the A's, the B's, the C's. Most importantly, B, LiDAR monitoring. There is going to be a host of opportunities for geophysics, for subsurface monitoring, a host of opportunities for new disciplines to be created from old historic disciplines as they're applied going forward. Transdisciplinary, by definition, has to have these 5 aspects in order to be considered transdisciplinary. It has to be inquiry driven. Obviously, climate change affects all of us in different ways in different places. Transdisciplinary is multilingual. We talked about electric generation versus subsurface reservoir. That's true and it's applicable, but it's also applicable from a social and natural scientist. And we'll talk later about permitting and public policy and how all those things fit together. It has to consider everything: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. We have to acknowledge that those of us that are doing the work bring our own bias to the table. As geophysicists, we view the subsurface in a certain way. We were educated in a certain way and taught how to look at it. There's nothing wrong with that, but we have to be cognizant of that and understand it so that we can identify any bias and be able to defend our methodology, if you will. And knowing that this whole process that we are in is going to change. It's not finite. and accepting that change helps. You're going to hear some new terms: ESG, environmental social governance. ESG is the combination of environmental concerns, social concerns, and governance concerns of companies, and where all those things come together and how they're viewed externally. And I'll give you an example here in a moment. Social license to operate, or SLO, is another term that you'll hear. And I'm going to provide a rhetorical question, but when was the last time any of you designed a project and looked at things? You were typically talking about signal to noise, reservoir issues, pore space. Now, as you look at projects going forward, you're going to have to deal with words like legitimacy, credibility, and trust. It's hard for a physicist or an engineer to understand what that means, because those issues, those phenomena exist on the social science side, not on the natural science side, but they're increasingly going to have an effect on the work that we do. And I say, as is usually the case, follow the money. The global ESG assets are going to rise likely to little over $50 trillion. If you look at 50 trillion in the global assets under management of 140 trillion, T's, you're talking about more than a third of all of the assets under management by people who are going to lend money to do projects. Over a third of that going forward is going to require the consideration of ESG and SLO to lend money. And so if we don't become proficient in and literate in those issues, we're going to be at a disadvantage for borrowing money. So this is where I'm going to pause and take a step back and dive into some very rudimentary discussions so we can set context of terms and definitions. What is carbon capture, utilization, and storage? In the old days, it was a three-legged stool: capture, transport, and storage. Pretty simple. You saw the transdisciplinary diagram of the Venn diagram. Those were the three circles. Very early on in the discussion, the lawyers and the politicians said, we don't like carbon capture and sequestration. The sequestration was the word used because they felt it was confusing, because we sequester juries and we sequester financial appropriations. And so people got confused. And so we changed the name from carbon capture and sequestration to carbon capture and storage. Early on in the 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't any kind of money available, and there was no driver in the US for saline storage. And so the only thing that worked was CO2 EOR. And so we had to find a place for CO2 EOR, and we called that utilization. And so CCS became CCUS. Now the U has gone from CO2 EOR to how can we capture that carbon dioxide and beneficiate it, make a product out of it. And we also talk about carbon dioxide, or carbon in many cases. But as you'll see, much of the work that's been done on the public policy side doesn't say carbon dioxide, it says carbon oxides. So that leaves the door open for carbon monoxide. And 45Q is a perfect example of that. If you've heard of the IRS tax credit, 45Q is written and it actually uses the word carbon oxide, not dye. So in general, many people view CCUS as a big giant vacuum cleaner that takes the flue gas from an electric-fired coal-fired power plant and transports it somewhere, puts it in the ground for perpetuity. The reality is it is a variety of different processes and materials across a whole bunch of supply chain issues, and ultimately being utilized or stored for either saline or straight disposal, straight storage, for CO2 EOR, for utilization, or in some cases, especially back east in Appalachia, there's access to storage in unminable coal seams. Not going to dive into great detail here, but to say from a capture standpoint, typically falls into three buckets: pre, post, and oxy-combustion. You're either taking the CO2 out before you burn it, you're taking it out after you burn it, or you're burning it in an oxygen-rich environment. All three of those have at varying degrees of what matters. Post-combustion was the easiest to start with because we have a whole fleet of coal-fired power plants. And so how can we go get the existing flue gas? So we started with post-combustion. A lot of work is done on pre-combustion so that we can get the CO2 out before we burn it, makes it easier to separate it. You get a cleaner stream, but it costs more money. And oxy-combustion is similar. You get a cleaner stream, but it costs more money to do that. And how we do all of those captures tends to fall in 4 buckets: absorption, membrane separation, adsorption, or chemical looping. And they all have application. One thing to think about as we add the new hydrogen economy, all of the hydrogen production, or most of the hydrogen, whether it's green, gray, pink, pick your color of hydrogen, they're almost all going to have a carbon capture separation piece. So this is going to get more complicated, more complex, i.e. more opportunities for that moving forward. Transportation, I think it's pretty straightforward, but I'm going to make a point here and reiterate it later. From a natural gas standpoint, we've got 2 million miles of pipeline, another 1 million miles of gathering line. You have 3 million miles of natural gas pipelines and gathering lines in the U.S. We've got about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, typically focused in Wyoming and the Northern Plains, as well as the Southeast Texas and Louisiana and Alabama. I'll talk later about the reality that they're both pipelines. And well, I'll talk about it right now. They're both pipelines. And I would argue that moving natural gas has significantly more risk. It explodes, it has killed people. It actually has a mortality rate that we can identify how many people, albeit small in the single digit, people die each year from results of leaking or exploding natural gas pipelines. Contrast that with only 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines with no reported deaths of any kind, but people are petrified of a CO2 pipeline. They're afraid that children are going to be born with 5 heads. And the reality is, if there's a leak, there's going to be a big giant pile of dry ice. Awesome. As a kid, I'd go out and play with it. But they are, from a risk standpoint, are very different, but they're perceived so differently. What is storage? Typically, and I'm talking here predominantly about the United States, not internationally, you're going to inject that CO2 either in an underground injection UIC class 6 or class 2 well. Generically, class 6, cartoon on the left, are deeper wells. They cost several $1 million to install, and there are currently 6 of them permitted in the United States. Contrast that with a class 2 EOR injection well costing several hundreds of thousands of dollars. There are tens of thousands, 100 plus, just shy of 200,000, I think, wells in the United States. And so we have a very contrasting view of the types of wells we used to get underground. So looking at the key elements of the value chain: capture, transport, storage. These are just some of the issues that we have to talk about. I did mention with transportation, this notion of the general public's concern over CO2 pipelines, but a relative acceptance of natural gas pipelines. All of these issues are things that have to be addressed, have a technical component. They require money, which means there has to be a discussion of risks and such going forward. And I would argue, and I'll make the points later, there are places here that many of you may have thought about where your industry can engage and participate. Most importantly, this is a rhetorical set of questions about where to build these things. If you look at the cartoon in the middle, and if you look at DOE's underground injection control program, they drew all these. They drew class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 wells. And it's ironic that the way they drilled them is that this well is drawn directly underneath the coal-fired power plant. It was their view back in the day, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, when they started talking about class 6, that they thought there would be one well at every coal-fired power plant, and we just take the CO2 and put it in the ground. Well, that's not the reality of the world. The reality of the world is we have a fair amount of electric generating power plants in New York and the Northeast. It's fairly true that there's likely to be 0 geologic storage in the granite rock of the Northeast. It's fairly true that there's going to be 0 geologic storage in California because the politics won't let that happen. So the question is, how do you deal with your source of CO2 to the sink and where you're going to put it in the ground? Are you going to put it in the ground in a class 6 or a class 2 well? Are you going to take existing class 2 wells and transition them to class 6? Are you going to put it in a greenfield site, brand new acquisition of underground assets? Or are you going to retrofit and repurpose an old oil field? Are we going to have to talk about doing, if you look at the map in the top right, there are places in the country where it makes sense to have these regional hubs. Or are we going to talk about some kind of national policy to be able to ensure that the coal-fired power plants and the CO2 in Florida and the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast can get to a place where we can get rid of it? How are we going to permit that? Who's going to be responsible versus primacy, whether this is the federal EPA or the state EPA doing it? Back to the earliest slide about scale. Are we going to compress the CO2 and to be able to run it in pipelines? Or are we not going to compress it, put it in trucks? And for those of you who do work out west, who owns the pore space? Is this on BLM, DOI land? Are we dealing with fee, state, or federal ownership? Are all questions that I don't have answers to, but I say then I argue that these questions provide opportunities for all of you. I'm going to go quickly through CO2 EOR because I'm assuming many of you understand that, but again, it's for context setting. Oil production 101, I use the Tropicana orange commercial. There's nothing in our orange juice but oranges. And if you take that straw and stick it in the orange and orange juice comes out, that's primary production. Very much like the Beverly Hillbillies when Jed Clampett at the opening credits, he goes and shoots and misses the raccoon or the possum or the squirrel, and the bullet goes in the ground and out comes oil. That's primary production. At some point in time, that orange juice that is going to stop flowing through that straw. And in many cases, we're going to have to add a second straw. And we're going to have to add water or methane or something else into that second straw to re-energize and recharge that reservoir. And we're going to produce more orange juice. And in this case, orange juice with water. We're going to have to separate that, which means we're going to have surface facilities, and it's going to cost money to create those surface facilities. Many of you may, I know it happens in my house, the basket on the kitchen table with the oranges, they don't get eaten right away and they get dry and hard. Sometimes I've taken that orange and run it between my hands and squinch it up a little bit, or I put it in the microwave for 5 seconds. When we do that, I'm talking now about tertiary recovery, where we're changing the physics of the rock. We're not just talking about changing the reservoir pressure and energy, but we're changing the physics. We're still talking about water, methane, or now we're talking about adding CO2. But by adding more things, we have more costs to get those things out on the back end. And what happens in the subsurface, I think many of you understand, but to the outside world, they miss. To the outside world, they think we do primary production, we're done. They think if they hear the word secondary production or water production, we're done. They think if they hear tertiary production, we're done. But the reality is maybe we've gotten to half of the oil in the reservoir, and we've got to deal with what's left. And to me, that comes down to this notion that it's always about the reservoir. Many times I have heard conversations or politicians ask, why don't we do X or Y? And the answer is we can't apply cookie cutters to reservoirs because reservoirs are different. Yes, there are some generic principles, engineering that we need to look at, but this is a conversation of homogeneous versus heterogeneous. And more importantly, there's more homogeneity in saline disposal than there is in EOR. And how do we deal with those differences? Miscibility is the major issue. Obviously, low viscosity, enhanced mobility, low interfacial surface tension. Those things allow us to get to move and extract the oil and the water more easily. The bigger arrow indicates the vast majority of the floods are miscible floods versus immiscible floods that are antithetical. You don't have the reservoir pressure because you're shallower. The oil composition is typically heavier. You've got swelling, you've got viscosity issues. And so how do we deal with all of those issues is important. And we typically deal with them in one of 3 flavors. It's not chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. It's heating, surfactants, and CO2. And again, the notion of all of those things go in, they've got to come out, and there's money, costs, if you will, capital and operating to get those things out. They all fit together into the notion of understanding a reservoir in vertical conformance, what's happening within that reservoir, what's happening horizontally with baffles, and understanding how we're going to be able to get fluid and pressure from point A to point B and what happens in between. And ultimately, it sounds logical, but I think it's often overlooked. What happens underground determines what happens above ground. What we put in ground, we have to take out above ground. And so looking at outcrops and sand grains to thin sections and pore throats and pore spaces is sometimes lost on many folks. Certainly isn't lost to this crowd, but can be lost. And so ultimately, I put all these things in a bucket to have a very non-technical conversation of what happens underground and why it's important. So as Dave indicated, I do a lot of international standards work. And the work we've done in ISO for CCUS, we struggled on the CO2 EOR discussion to try and make people understand what we're trying to do. And a dear friend in Norway came up with the analogy of, let's talk about a barn. Let's just talk about the old-fashioned farm barn of how big a barn do we need? What's our storage capacity and our porosity? How much space do we have in the barn? And then more importantly, how fast can we put the horses or the cows or the pigs in the barn? How many doors do we need to have? How big do those doors need to be? How sturdy is the barn? How long is this barn going to stand? Is it got good foundations and good timbers? Is it a shingle roof or a tin roof? What is our cap rock, our basement? What is our MVA ability to know what's going on outside the barn? And then lastly, to a social license to operate in an ESG, can you build the barn? And if so, where? And so those of us who are technically oriented typically think about these problems, these projects in the order I just described them. 1, 2, 3, 4. How big's the barn? What's my injectivity? What's my cap rock, basement, MVA attachment? And then I'll deal with the permitting. But public policy folks in many cases think about this exactly oppositely. 4, 3, 2, 1. Who cares how big your barn is if you can't build it? Who cares what your MVA plan is if you're never going to be able to build a barn because you're never going to get a permit? So looking at these 4 major issues, and more importantly, looking at them in an order that's important to the people making the decisions, can be enlightening about what's important now and when we do or don't do certain things. And that leads to a question of how are we going to ask and answer those questions? And I'm going to use this analogy to describe that. So whether you get your CO2 from a salt dome, whether you get it anthropogenically from a coal-fired power plant, or whether you get it from direct air capture, that CO2 is going to be injected into a CO2 EOR operations as purchased CO2. At some point in time, you're going to fill up the reservoir, you're going to have saturation, and some of that CO2 is going to get recycled. It's going to be brought to the surface, you're going to separate it, and you're going to put it back in the ground. And in all cases, time X or time minus Y, you're going to need to understand and differentiate between blue CO2 and purple CO2, anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic, purchased and recycled. And the question is, how does one do that? The easiest way to do that, that satisfies most of the people, is through a life cycle assessment. And the question is, what is a life cycle assessment? It's a way for us to talk about whether this process meets, exceeds, or fails to do certain things. So if you look at the boxes on the left, atmosphere, land, ocean, and geosphere, if we currently have emissions that go to the atmosphere, we call that emissions. We are adding, in this case, CO2 to the atmosphere. If we put CCUS on something, on a plant, and we capture those CO2, and we negate out the amount of CO2 that we would have generated by what we store, we say we have net zero. And in some cases, depending on the fuel, bioenergy, that is, if we use switchgrass and wood and other things that captured CO2 and they grew, and use that as our fuel to generate the electricity, we're taking CO2 that was already captured and we're capturing the CO2 from its combustion and putting it in the ground. Some people call that negative. Now, I'm going to argue here, some would say satirically and cynically, that my dear friend Mike Godek at ARI is an expert in this, and he talks about planet Earth. And in the end final analysis, the only set of boundaries that are non-arguable is Earth. Because if you move those boundaries to say, well, I'm only looking at X or Y, people can argue and say, while we understand your argument, you haven't actually collected certain things. And so the argument becomes, how do we have this discussion and get on the same page? So from an LCA standpoint, it's a set of decision-making tools to identify burdens, and in this case, environmental, social. We evaluate the consequences of those from an environmental or social justice standpoint, and we look at it from cradle to grave over the lifetime, and we have to set these boundaries to define what we're talking about. I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about boundaries to make the point, and then get close to some question and answers. So most life cycle assessments have a framework. You lay out what your value chain is, and you decide capture, transport, storage, refining, distribution. Are we going cradle to grave? Are we going gate to gate just to look at CO2 EOR? Are we going gate to wheel? Make up your terms in green, but you decide, if you're doing the LCA, what your intent and purpose is, where these boundaries belong. Once you've identified that, there are a host of tools. This is an example of a set of databases and models that were built to be able to get the data necessary to identify how much CO2 is emitted, captured, stored, taken out of the life cycle, so that you can do the analysis. And so this example discusses, if you look at the top left, I've drawn a black line around petroleum production. It's CO2, EOR, and refining. But I've ignored direct air capture and using those fuels, airplane, jet fuel, avgas, kerosene, gasoline. In the second circle, I've added direct air capture. In the third circle, I've added all types of CO2, and I've actually included use of consumption and burning of those fuels. And I've added the little airplane pilot and the little ship captain to say the airplane pilot and the ship captain had to get to work. Did they drive to work? Did they ride their bike to work? And do you capture those things? And the point here with the certified public accountant logo on the left is, any good accountant will tell you, tell me what you're trying to say, and I will massage, manipulate, and destroy the numbers to make the argument you want to make. That is to say, you can get a CPA to make the numbers look the way you want, depending on where you draw the boundaries. So this is important to say, as Mike Godick has said, the only boundary that you can't argue with is the Earth, but that creates such a big, complicated, unwielding type of analysis that you can't do a lot of good work with the analysis. So it comes down to a notion of, what are you trying to accomplish? And can you articulate what you're trying to accomplish and have a defensible methodology? Because people are going to argue. People are going to say it doesn't matter and argue and challenge you on what you've done. And I'll give you a couple examples. So under the 45Q tax credit, this is IRS form 8933. I'm assuming none of us on our personal taxes have to do this, but it's pretty straightforward. If you do saline in yellow box 1 and 3, how much CO2 did you put in the ground in 2021? And how much CO2 did you put in the ground over the 12 years of this program? If you're an EOR operator, it's box 2 and 4. How much did you do this year and how much did be done over the course of the 12 years? And you have to manage and tell the EPA and the IRS through your monitoring and verification plan or the ISO document how you arrived at those numbers, i.e. an LCA. In the EPA's subpart RR, they have a mass balance that generically looks like this. You've got to take all of these parts and pieces, collect data, normalize the data, and say data in, data out. We're 100% compliant, data in, data out. We can only account for 92%. Where'd the 8% go? Is it leakage or so forth? The ISO 27916 mass balance for CO2R is similar. It has a bit more pieces of details in it, but nonetheless is a mass balance, data in, data out. So I'm going to try and come full circle here, make a few points, and then have a conversation. Environmental social governance has many pieces that have life cycle assessment dependencies. When you look at the environmental piece of the efficiencies, the climate change emissions, looking at on the social side, data protection and privacy, how did you get your data to say how much emissions you had? What are your controls over, is that data secure? Is that data normalized? And what are you going to do to literally put that data in a safe and guarantee it's there like your IRS documents? So 8 years from now, if somebody wants to come and audit you, you can actually find those. I'm going to make a rhetorical point here. I'm going to talk fast to try and make a point to get to the end of this conversation. LCAs are all about the who, what, where, when, and why. And you, as the entity creating them, get to decide where those boundaries lie. And therefore, you get to decide when you share this with the outside world, what the arguments are going to be or not be. And so you have to ask yourself, am I trying to do just CO2 with anthropogenic? Am I going to do CO2 with recycle? Am I going to look at just hydrogen, petroleum production in midstream, or I go all the way to downstream in the actual consumption of the fuels? Am I looking at anthropogenic CO2, or am I only looking at transportation fuels? Do I not care about methane or anything else, and I only care about CO2? And do I care about the employees who came to work to do all those things? And what I'm trying to say is, if you look at these examples, very quickly, you can see that deciding where the boundaries go matter. They matter significantly. So be prepared to have the discussion and acknowledgement that the only indefensible boundary is the earth, but there are ways to defend your methodology, why I included or excluded what I did. So to the meat of the matter, hopefully why you all decided to sign up and come today. What does this mean to you, and how can it affect your career? In the Federal Register, which is the documentation that the IRS put out that said for 45Q tax credit, we will accept EPA subpart RR or ISO 27916 as the methodology to determine how much CO2 is put in the ground. In that reference, 39 times they use the term qualified independent engineer geologist. I was lucky, I was blessed to be on a group, a team that met with the IRS and convinced them to use those 5 words, qualified independent engineer geologist, and no other words. There was a huge discussion about had to be a PE, had to be a PG, had to be a member of a national trade organization, SEG, AAPG, SPE. There were discussions about that the geologist or engineer could or could not work for the company submitting it. We convinced them to take all those out and leave it as qualified independent, which means it's up to the company and the entity putting together this LCA to decide what that means for them. And it's up to you, if you're doing the work, to affirm that you are qualified and independent. I have talked to several folks who can argue and have successfully that even though they're a geologist for oil and gas operator X, they can still be qualified and independent. So I believe there's a significant amount of opportunity for you all. If you look at the LCA tools for CCUS and EOR, these pie charts look at CapEx and OpEx. And the black dotted lines are the little teeny tiny sliver of monies that are necessary for storage. And you can see that those teeny tiny, they're significantly insignificant. As a result, there has been very little work on the LCA side, which is why I showed you those graphs with the hand-drawn and the LCA piece. Work is being done just now on how to do accurate, correct LCAs for the storage piece. Because it was so small financially, the industry said, we'll deal with it later. What's really important are the big dollar issues, the capture piece, and that's where all the energy has been spent. So there is work happening now, and I would argue that that work could be influenced by you, or you could participate in looking at those LCAs. So whether it's a notion of talking about the barn and the process to do one of these things, whether it's looking at new disciplines that come in, LCAs, dealing with social license to operate. I think there's a variety of ways that your industry, can take what you know and apply it. And I'm gonna summarize it in 6 issues. You all are extremely smart. All of the geophysicists I've ever worked with have been terribly intelligent. That science and that discipline is vastly unknown to the rest of the world. Just like Dave indicated, he didn't realize how much he didn't know. All of the non-geophysicists will tell you, gee, I didn't know, fill in the blank about geoscience. And so I think the more you all can talk about what you do and talk about it as an influencer and a good storyteller, not from the standpoint of let's dive into the weeds of signal to noise and how we're going to reduce the inflection of all of our velocities. Think about who you're talking to. That is executive decision makers in your company, your politicians, decision makers at the state and local level. Understand that you might be talking to lawyers, economists, or teachers who are on local county boards. If you understand more than just your piece, i.e. what's important to these folks, are they trying to make a decision about number 4 in the barn, should I even build it, versus how big is it? You can help them understand those things, engage with conflicting viewpoints, because there are going to be. Regardless of which side of the fence you choose to be on, there will always be people on the other side. And I find passion and gratitude in accepting the challenge to have those conversations. Take them on. Almost everybody, I'm assuming, in this audience today has a graduate degree. At some point in time, we had to stand or sit up in front of that board, the table with those older professors and realize they're going to poke holes. They're going to take shots at what we just spent the last 2 to 4 to 8 years of our life on. And you did it. Yes, it was nervous. Yes, it was hard, but I think we're all better for it. So my closing comment is, I think these things, while they don't sound sexy and scientific, these 6 things, I think, have a significant opportunity for all of you to engage in what you do. And so with that, I thank you very much and anxious to have a conversation.
Steve, I'd like to ask you about a couple of things before we open it up for general discussion.
You're in charge, so you get to do whatever you want, pal.
Okay. Back in November, you made a couple of points in that presentation that I don't think you did today that had a big impact on me. And one of them, so I'm looking at this from I'm not actually my perspective, but someone who maybe is an undergraduate, they're good at math and physics, and they're considering a career in geophysics, but looking at it go, well, it's a shrinking industry. I think we all understand the oil and gas industry needs to shrink. Why would I go into that field? And one of the things I believe you said, if you look at what needs to be done, and I can't remember what international organization was setting what needs to be done, but the investment, as I recall, was something like 1.5 times the size of the current oil industry. Did I get that right?
Yep, you're right.
So that's an important point if I were a young person considering a career, and I thought geophysics is interesting, but I don't want to go into something that's shrinking.
Right.
That thing, it may grow slowly, but if it's going to get there, it's going to be a huge industry.
Right. So,
and then you have to back up and say, is this actually necessary? I could take us off topic here and say,
yeah,
little I know, you can only slow global warming unless you're using some form of carbon storage. The other thing that was interesting, that I think would be interesting to this audience and that young person in school, is that I think you made the point that a lot of times the production of the carbon and the storage, these optimal storages are not in the same location. It's not
right.
correct. So right. You need to use, I'm going to use the term slummy reservoirs that are convenient. So now you're using something that's not perfectly flat, unfaulted, and highly porous. So now you care about reflection seismic, so you know where the faults are. Geophysics, right? Reservoir modeling to understand all these kind of things. Many of the same tools we use right now to understand reservoirs so we can extract oil, we'll also need to have that sort of depth of understanding so that we can inject carbon.
Right. So let me go back and just fill in some dips. You're right. The conversation was, in order to have full-scale CCUS deployment and enough to cover our current existing electric fleet, we're going to have to make an investment the size, I think it was close to double the size, financial and labor size of our current oil and gas E&P industry. And the question is spot on of, well, how do we do that and what does that mean? And the answer is, I think if you're an undergrad, it would be really easy to double major in geophysics and economics, geophysics and public policy. It would be really easy, if you want to stay a geophysicist, to take a class or two in public policy, to take a class or two in economics, or vice versa. If you think because it's not growing as fast as you want, be an economics major or a public policy major, but take a few classes, or if you're halfway to, get a minor in physics, a minor in geophysics. Again, the notion of becoming multilingual is the biggest value that I think can be added, because so few people are. It's so difficult when in my experience and in the other folks that I work with at Oklahoma and Louisiana and Texas, when we go to Washington, it's like having a disciplinary conversation. If we're talking to a politician, they can't understand the technical piece. They only want to talk about, what does the public policy mean? How do I write the text of the bill to get from one chamber to the next? If you're talking with the MVA folks, they don't care about the public policy, but I think we have to care, because they all influence how what we do gets done or doesn't get done. And it certainly influences how fast it does or doesn't get done, and how well it does or doesn't get done.
Okay, so
go ahead, keep going.
Open up to general questions. I'm assuming, Annabella, that you'll moderate that.
Yes. So there are already 12 questions on the Q&A box and some comments in here. First of all, great talk. Lots of interest. People are asking for the recording and access to it. So thank you.
I will send you, Annabelle, the copy of the slide deck, so you're welcome to share that with anybody.
Oh, that will be amazing. Somebody asked for the slide deck as well.
As soon as I'll get it to you today.
Perfect. Press person Steve Roche made an observation, not a question, said induced seismicity issues in Oklahoma associated with wastewater disposal was good intro to SLO.
Correct. And you see those, you'll see those things that happen in our industry, like the induced seismicity in Oklahoma, bring to this attention. And so the folks that were there in that process in Oklahoma have an advantage, because I think they knew about these issues earlier. You all are having an opportunity to understand these things earlier. Most of the technical industry here don't get it yet and will be behind you. And so that's another advantage that you all have, is the sooner we can get more bilingual understandings of the pieces, the faster you'll be able to have an influence in your career.
All right. Ben Stewart says, do you think your slide 10 is flawed with respect to utility and development of long-term sustainable CCUS strategies based on the subsequent slides?
I'm going to pull up slide 10, and I'm not sure it's slide 10. So that's my slide 10. Is that the slide?
I think that comment came when you were talking about the pipelines and transportation of CO2 versus transportation of natural gas. Okay.
And so given that that's the context, the question again is, do I think slide 10 is flawed with respect to utility development for long sustainable based on subsequent slides? I don't think it's flawed, and I'll answer here. Here's why I'll defend and say it's not flawed. I've done some research and some work with some law firms and written a couple papers on some entitled CCUS Transportation, the Red Herring. And in that work, we uncovered the fact that there really is much more significant risk for natural gas pipeline. But people understand that we have to have natural gas, or they understand that I have to heat my house and I have to cook my food, and I'm willing to accept that risk of transporting natural gas to get to be able to do that. I would argue the antithesis, that many people have not accepted that climate change is real. Many people have not accepted that we can address climate change with CCUS. So their human side has said, I'm unwilling to accept that risk, and I'm going to keep fighting to say I don't want pipelines. Not because they have more risk, but they actually have less risk, but they're fighting because of an ideological position, and that they're using that as a piece to say, I don't want the overall CCUS to happen, and therefore if I eliminate a piece that connects them all, I have a chance to win. Great question, Ben, and I'll be happy to have conversation offline. Email me, call me, and love to have a conversation. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, there was a comment made while you were saying that from Brian Fuller, saying you cannot slow climate change. There are many factors beyond CO2 that are naturally occurring, forcing functions, and the relationship between the factors is far more complex than that we currently understand. If these were not true, then why would current numerical models fail to predict climate? How, therefore, do we justify all of this effort to sequester CO2 when we could be spending this money on replacing oil and gas with nuclear energy?
I couldn't have stated the obvious better. I am in full agreement with your statement. As a physicist, I agree that the climate has changed, is changing, and will continue to change regardless of what we do with CCUS, regardless of what any entity, political or otherwise, does. Having said that, neither you nor I have the ability to stop the US government or the IPCC or the Chinese or the Australian government from doing what they're doing or not doing. Many people will argue and fight politically because they have an ideological piece, but I completely agree with you. Now, I'm going to put on my technical hat. I think we all agree that models are flawed. The only thing that's true about the model is the minute you run it, it's wrong. And the question then becomes that we all do is how can we tweak that state of function, physical state, equation of function, so that we can do history matching and get that to come down and match. I agree with you. From a climate perspective, we can't do it. It's too complicated, never happened, and that's why none of the models ever worked. But having the conversation as directly and as succinctly as you did, talking to people who are non-transdisciplinarian, who are strictly disciplinarians, is like talking to my 3-year-old grandchild. Great question, great comment, and I'm 100% on board with it.
All right, next question from Albert Mendy. How comfortable are you with the existing methods for detecting CO2 leakage from storage sites, as well as its possible mixing with underground water aquifers?
I guess the question is, what do you mean by comfortable? As an oil and gas guy, we have taken oil and gas out of reservoirs that are traps that Mother Nature has put there for millennia, for eons, that don't have access. Yes, there are leaks. There are residual oil zones. There are natural water floods that we do get, reservoirs that leak to and across underground water aquifers. Those should be off the table. We shouldn't use them. But I also agree that we do have enough. We have the ability to characterize reservoirs to the point where we can say, that's a good reservoir, that's not. Do it there, don't do it there, as opposed to having those of a certain belief that I don't want. Let me pause here and clarify my answer a little better. There are some in the NGO community, especially the environmental non-governmental organizational community, who don't believe in CCUS because they believe it's perpetuating the production of hydrocarbons, because we're going to continue to burn coal and natural gas to create the electricity, and because if you use CO2 EOR, you're continuing to produce more hydrocarbons. So they're non-believers in CCUS. So they will say anything that I can find and poke holes to say that's a risk, that's a risk, that's a risk, creates opportunities for them to say they don't want to do that. To your point, I think that we have long been able to monitor what happens. I would argue that CO2 EOR operators know better where that CO2 and the oil is than in saline disposal, because A, they've got typically decades of practice and data to know what the characterization of the reservoir looks like. and they have to buy that CO2. And so they aren't being willy-nilly and assuming that CO2 is leaking somewhere else because they have to pay for that to replace it. Last comment I'll make is most underground aquifers, especially drinking water aquifers, are significantly more shallow. We typically aren't getting water from 10,000 feet and below. And so we typically have significant cap rock and separation. But again, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you offline if you want to talk more about it, Albert. Great question.
Next question is from Edward Butcher. Please discuss how CO2 can be injected into a class 2 well.
It's injected now. I mean, we've done that for 40 years. You look at all the CO2 EOR industry, they're putting CO2 in the class 2 into the reservoir. Back to my comment of homogeneous versus heterogeneous, you have to look at the reservoir. In the same fashion that operators look at how do they do a water flood, are they using a 5-spot, an inverted 7-spot? You have to know your reservoir. You have to know where your baffles are. You have to know where communication, what your vertical and horizontal conformance is, because you're going to produce that reservoir in a most efficient manner. The same is true for CO2. You want to get that CO2 into the reservoir in a manner in which it can be most effective and efficient in communicating across the reservoir in a fashion that you understand. Whether you know it's going slow or going fast, typical answer is as long as the CO2 is doing what I think it's supposed to do, then you're successful. So we've done it for 40 years. I say we, the industry, starting in the Permian at SACROC. So hopefully that answers your question. Again, all of these, if knowing we're trying to get a lot in short time, all of my contact information is available. Be happy to reach out. Be happy to have a conversation with you.
All right. Next question from, I guess, initial velocity. I don't know. Thanks for sharing, Steve. What are your thoughts on Tesla planning to get into the CCUS business in relation to their known unknown expertise in subsurface?
I'm looking for the question.
It should be right at the top.
Right at the top. Okay.
CEO or
on Tesla. Why is Tesla getting? Well, I think you're going to have a lot of people getting into the business. Microsoft wants to get in the business. I'll use a term that may not be applicable, but it might be good to describe. I think people are going to virtue signal. I think Tesla has an issue of they need electricity. So they need to find things that are supportive of electric generation, and CCUS is. I need to know more about what you think their thoughts of getting into the business. What does a venture capitalist do being in the business? None, other than they're lending money. My notion here of the question is that Tesla's planning to lend money and that they'll go out and get experts, subsurface experts, to say, I want to have a business. Let's turn it on its head. They have some of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world. If they want to put CCUS on the internal electric generation that they have so that they can say we are net zero or net negative, that's a benefit to them from an investor because they're publicly traded. Again, I go back to use the word virtue signaling. There's probably a mix of virtue signaling and they can find some financial and technical reasons to do that, but don't know enough about what they're doing to answer it any more discreetly than that.
All right, I'm gonna follow with Albert Mendy. Electric cars start monitoring CO2 pollution after purchase from showroom, but is there any effort to monitor and account for CO2 pollution that occurs when raw materials for electric cars are mined, refined, transported, and manufacture of the car is done?
Absolutely perfect statement. Couldn't agree with you more, which is why LCAs are important. I think so many people who were on the supportive end of we have to get rid of all internal combustion engines view the electric socket with the two holes and the two holes as some magic mouse on a wheel that's in there spinning, that they don't perceive that the electrons that are in there only got there because they were produced somewhere. They were produced at an electric or at a coal, natural gas, hydro, or nuke facility, all of which may or may not have carbon emissions. You're absolutely right. There's more carbon intensity in creating the battery for those cars, and it's not talked about. And I will use the antithetical argument of the argument I made for LCAs and boundaries. Because people can use that, they're using it to their advantage. The electric car industry is saying, look at the LCA, but we're only talking about the car itself, driving it off the showroom, to use your example. Look how fantastic it is. But when you expand the boundaries out and include the same kinds of things that one ought to, of the manufacturer and the raw materials to create that car, that carbon intensity goes through the roof. So great perspective. And I'm certainly an advocate of not limiting. Well, it's a perfect example of people using an LCA to make a statement they want. And great for you to notice that it's not accurate.
All right, I'm going to jump into a very popular question from Eric Davis. Fantastic presentation, Steve. My perception is that CCUS currently has a terrible reputation outside the energy industry, to the extent it's known at all. It's seen as horribly expensive, wasteful, power plants efficiency drops 30%, risky, see Aliso Canyon, and the demo projects to date are easy to criticize. Gordon, Boundary Dam. My expectation is that the technology is politically almost impossible to implement at scale unless the major environmental groups are convinced that CCUS is the right path forward. Do you agree, and do you see a potential path to that happening?
I agree with everything you've said. I think it's a very astute perspective, and I'll give you the very simple answer. I don't believe CCUS at scale will happen in the United States if and until the federal government passes a mandate. Very much to the points you're making, the perceptions of, is it good or bad? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Does it meet with the political climate change mitigation? Some say yes, some say no. I'll get a little bit longer in my answer and give an example. The AEP, American Electric Power, in Columbus, Ohio, owned a facility on the Ohio River. And they took some $600 million from the Department of Energy, did a CCUS study, built a pilot scale, drilled a 12,000-foot well into the Mount Simon sandstone along the Ohio River, identified great storage. This is perfect. We're all good to go. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 4 is, let's build the plant. And when phase 4 came out, the CEO of AEP said, I'm done. And DOE lost its mind. We just gave you $600 million to do this study. The science says it's right. Why aren't you going forward? And his answer was pretty easy. This is going to be a $700 million addition to my power plant. I'm a publicly traded electric utility. I have an obligation to provide a dividend and a return to my investors. If I spend $700 million today to put carbon capture on that plant, because I'm an IOU, an investor-owned utility, I have to go to the Public Service Commission in my state, in the states that I service, and they have to approve my rates. CCUS is not mandated by law, and therefore, if I invest $700 million, I can't take that $700 million, roll it into my rates, distribute it amongst the 700 customers I have, and get $1 million each back from them. And so he made a very valid fiduciary comment that unless I'm mandated by law to do this, especially for publicly traded companies, I actually have an incentive not to do it because I'm not meeting my legal obligations to provide a return. So long-winded answer to your question. Internationally, lots of these types of things are happening because federal governments have said thou shalt. I would argue, for those of you that are old enough to remember the Waxman-Markey Act back in the 90s, passed the House but never ratified by the Senate, was a carbon cap and trade. Never passed, doesn't exist. If and until the United States has a mandate, I don't see this happening. Hopefully.
Steve, can I interject something there?
Absolutely.
Wouldn't a carbon tax do the same thing without having to be quite?
Yes. Open up my cap and trade and say, call it a carbon tax, call it a penalty, call it anything you want. That, in my opinion, two things have to happen. The government has to make the market respond, which it hasn't to date, and the market has to allow the industry to recoup its costs. That is, when an electric coal plant buys coal, it takes the cost of that fuel and passes it along to the people it provides electricity to. If they have to put CCUS on just like they had to put NOx and SOx and sulfur scrubbers and all those other things. When they had to do that, when they put those bag houses on, they were able to pass those costs along and get paid back for that. Once industry says it can be recoup those costs over a period of time, I think you'll see industry move. But short a mandate and ability to recoup costs, I don't see it moving. Not moving to full scale. I continue to see research. I continue to see virtue signaling. I think you'll continue to see, as long as DOE funds research, you'll have the carbon safe projects that are out there. You'll have other things, but you won't have full scale commercial deployment.
Okay, I'm not sure if Ben Stewart has a comment on top of this, so I'm gonna allow him to talk.
Shoot.
Ben, you can unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, Steve? Hey,
Yes,
listen, one of the things that I've noticed, do you think that part of the problem with the perception of CO2 goes to the fact that we use environment and climate change interchangeably? In the fact that it goes back to the question about slide 10, is the fact that climate allows you to ignore the trade-offs that you mentioned. I think it was on slide 39 in the total deck, where you have to consider the economics, the social, and the environmental, the economic impacts on what you're doing. Because that to me is a root of this, because it forces developed nations to ignore the utility of resource and capital in making CCUS decisions that the developing world is being forced to. And you have the West developing strategies that have no application to the 60 or 70% of the world that's going to be using hydrocarbons till 2070 based on COP26.
Absolutely. So I'm going to take a huge risk. And by doing so, I'm going to apologize up front. I am doing this to make an analogy and try and affirm your point. And so I'm going to tell everybody right now, I'm going to apologize if I offend anybody. And I mean that seriously, because I'm going to talk about the U.S. abortion issue to make this point. In the U.S. abortion issue, people are entrenched on both sides, regardless of it. And I'm not choosing a position. But I argue that both sides are completely entrenched because they can't agree on the definition of life. They can't agree on when it begins and when it doesn't. And because they can't agree on that, they can't have a conversation, and they don't. The same is true, Ben, for what you just said. Because we can't agree on environment versus climate change, because we use different language to describe what we think we mean the same, but we really aren't, we conflate things that make it impossible for us to have a conversation and talk about. So your perception is perfect. And I'll advance it one step further and say, do we really think the leaders, the political leaders, the leaders at COP, the IPCC, do we really think that any of them are bilingual enough, are perceptive enough to be able to understand and accept this and have a conversation? And I argue they aren't. And so unfortunately, until more people like those of you that are here get in places where we can have influence and educate people about how we should have a conversation, not what the answer is, I don't see us having a real good solution. But I think you're spot on with what you perceive.
Excellent analogy. And I think that it actually forces you into the fact that for the people who are on geoscientists, what you said about, being multilingual as far as your talents and background, I'd say that your analogy actually reinforces the fact that science today, particularly engineering and geology, have to really reconsider what a student needs to acquire as far as school during his undergraduate to be able to plot a career in the management and production of natural resources, non-renewable natural resources, which I think that what you said, the relevance to the people who are on here, who are geophysicists and geoscientists, is the fact that if they don't have a better understanding of the social element and the economic components, then they're going to have a limited utility, because CCUS is not going to be sustainable.
Correct. I think you are very astute in acknowledging much of this is about our educational system. Again, I'm not picking sides, but if you look at our K-12 and our secondary education, in part of my PhD research was looking at the education of geologists and engineers and the way in which they're taught to look at the world biases much of their thinking. And it made me think about another opportunity that I hadn't thought about is, again, many of you have to have gray hair like me, but if you have the experience and you've got the degrees, I strongly suggest you all go back to college, not to become a student, but to teach. Go back and become an adjunct. Go back and say to your local university, I've got this great passion and I see the world this way. Can I help you? Because if 1% of the people on this call got back to a university, how many students will be affected? And to your point, it goes back to the undergraduate students. If we get to them early, we have a better chance to have more analytical and complex thought folks who can come out and do the work we're talking about.
All right. So let's move on to, and that's a great point. I want to say, Steve, and I want to mention that on the SEG side, at least for undergrad students and partially graduates, like students on graduate programs, we are defining a branch of the Evolve internship dedicated to CCUS. And we have today on the call Nancy House, who is leading our efforts for defining the program so we can reach to these students earlier and give them a more practical experience on what it is to do carbon sequestration.
Pleasure to meet you, Nancy. Reach out. I'd love to have a conversation with you when time permits.
Let me see if she didn't raise her hand, but
put her on the spot.
Yeah, let me get her name and.
I see her. She just chatted. I'll send her a note.
Yeah. I can. Here. Nancy, I allow you to talk if you want to say a couple comments and then I'll jump to another question on the.
I am really thrilled to have been able to get on this and hear you because I was one of the first people at Colorado School of Mines to attempt an interdisciplinary degree between reservoir characterization and management, geophysics, and economics. So
good.
Anyway,
good for you.
That's why I'm so passionate and have pushed so long to get a CO2 Evolve program going. So your discussion just outlined most of what we hope to capture in that course with that program. I won't call it a course, with a focus on reservoir care, on the geologic aspects of it. But yes, I'm passionate about the planet, and hopefully we can put together a really good program after a successful pilot this year.
Wonderful. Best of luck.
We'll make sure to invite you.
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to go to the next question from Werner Hill. I'm sorry if I butchered the name. Looking at the dollar figures, I am wondering who is going to pay. CCUS will represent additional cost to operators that their stakeholders are probably not willing to swallow. I will therefore think that these operators will try to keep their CCUS cost as low as possible, meaning that there will be very little room for science and technology. So a little bit back to your comment.
Great assessment. And if you'll allow me to refer back to the comment I had with Ben, you're right. What commercial E&P operator is going to fund science that everybody else gets to use and they get no advantage, no commercial advantage of? And the answer is they won't. Therefore, the lion's share of the de-risking of the science has to come from the federal government. Again, not trying to be political, just telling you, stating the obvious. The Trump administration was very pro-coal, pro-gas, pro-natural resources. There was a fair amount of money in the CCUS arena to do that work. The Biden administration, not so much. The Biden administration has actually changed the name of the Department of Energy Fossil Energy Group to Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. The Biden administration has said openly, we are not going to fund one dime of research that prolongs the use of coal or natural gas. So now you've raised a point that is obvious, but puts us in a box. If the federal government's not going to pay for it, and industry who's not going to get anything for it, who's going to do it? And the answer is nobody. The answer is it's going to be very difficult to have this go forward. These are the kinds of things like a world war, the moonshot. These are the kinds of big federal government things that our federal government needs to lead and de-risk. And currently this government has said no to fossil energy. And so it's difficult. I agree with the notion that the IPCC, I agree with the data that says you can't get to the reductions that they want without CCUS. We have too big a coal and natural gas fleet that if we ignore it without using CCUS, we'll never get to the numbers, and neither will it happen internationally. But you philosophically get into the argument of there are those who are pushing for climate change mitigation who will also say it can't be with the continuation of coal and natural gas, and CCUS fits into that notion, so they say no. So your point has raised an issue that has a very antithetical reaction depending on which side you're on, and I don't know what the answer is. But very astute observation.
There were a couple comments by Paul Wire on that, saying, and given that CCUS is not profit making on its own right, what happens to the CCUS industry if the subsidy incentive is abruptly changed by shifting policies? And then PF Rooks said companies will then move to countries with higher acceptance in CO2 emissions.
And the answer is that that's a true statement. The government has tried to say, let's give you some incentives. So the IRS 45Q tax credit currently pays you $35 a ton for CO2 EOR and $50 for saline. There's discussions to change that to go to $65 a ton for CO2 EOR and $80 a ton for saline. So they're trying to incentivize financially that to happen. But there's no guarantee that'll happen from a full-scale commercial deployment. So again, very much the notion of without a mandate, industry responds well to rules. Industry responds well to, say, the electric generation industry responded well to the acid rain laws that said you've got to get the NOx and SOx. You've got to get the nitrous oxide and the sulfur dioxides out of the atmosphere, and you have to put the scrubbers and the baghouses on. Because once it became law, they invested all that money to do those environmental controls, and they could pass those dollars on. So we're in this situation. It's a really, really strange situation of globally, we all say, or many of us say, we want this and it has to happen. But the detailed mechanisms to allow industry to respond, at least in the US as a fair market, without a mandate, it isn't happening. Great discussion. And again, now we could easily bring an economist and a public policy person to this discussion and talk for 4 more hours. Thus the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary nature of CCUS.
And hopefully we'll get to do that in the near future. I'm going to go to the next question, Richard Van Dock. I realize you're presenting today to a group of geoscientists, but for perspective, can you talk a little about disposal alternative to subsurface carbon storage? In other words, what are other options if subsurface storage is not possible, and how do the economics compare?
The answer is there are options, and you'll see a lot of use of the word utilization now. Where we'll take the CO2 and we'll put it into concrete. You'll make other products. There's some great research out there about taking the CO2 and putting it in to the manufacture of asphalt, so it'll go into the roads that we put down. You'll see the CO2 being used in making filament fibers that could then be wound together, woven to make building materials, such as airplane skins for wings. There's a lot that can happen. The issue is twofold with that. Number one, the economics aren't there yet because it's all early research, and the costs got to come down through the valley of death for the IP, the intellectual property piece. But let's assume you do all that and it's widely economic. The issue is one of scale. We can't remove enough CO2. we can't use enough CO2 that we've captured into all these products. We'll never get there because that is such a small subset of the actual amount of CO2 that's captured that we can't meet the goals, which goes back to the IPCC report acknowledging it's a fact, if you look at the data, that you can't get the CO2 out of the atmosphere that doesn't also include CCUS. But there are many who say because CCUS still perpetuates the natural resource coal and gas industry, we don't want it. So we're back to an issue of what is our definition of why we're trying to do this. So it's a great question, but I don't see us having the ability to get there from a scaling standpoint.
All right. The Huahan said, could you estimate the impact of CCUS effort in carbon zero effort? Jens Eric Lonsny commented, CCUS is considered critical for net zero, but it requires a many factor increase in capacity. And he provided, or she, a webpage for calculations relative to net zero carbon, but do you have any comments on it?
It goes back to the notion of LCAs, that there are lots of pieces. Remember that the one slide I had where there's a framework and a set of tools. There are a lot of tools that are out there, but there are more tools that need to be developed. Again, I think there's a place for smart natural scientists. I think there's a terrible place for a geoscientist who can't find work in the subsurface to take that knowledge of the subsurface and go work on developing some of these tools at some of the national labs, at some of the universities. I am not advocating that someone should leave the passion of their chosen field, but if someone is having a difficult time doing that, I think there's lots of opportunities to build on what's there and identify these new pieces for how do I collect the data and what are the tools within the LCA framework.
All right, Chris Walker, I'm curious of your opinion. Some are waiting to see what happens with changes in incentive over the next few years before investing more in CCUS. Some are not waiting, however, and investing now. What is your feeling for how much of this transition will happen because of morality considerations versus maintaining high profit margins that depend on future incentives?
I think the easy answer is if you go back and remember the early slide that talked about $54 trillion of the $140 trillion that are going to be under asset management will have some form of ESG requirement. So the answer is, in that constraint, I think you're going to see a significant increase in morality consideration for investing. The bigger question is 50 trillion that's available going to be enough distributed over the entire globe and all the developers to get the CCUS market to where it needs to be? I don't know the answer to that. I certainly would agree that if all 140 trillion was available to be lent to do projects, you have a statistical chance of being 3 times more effective. But I certainly agree that there will be a morality consideration going forward. The question is whether or not that morality effort gets the job done, gets us to the point where it actually makes a dent and does something, and I'm not sure of that.
All right, let's see. Steve Roche, in the overall discussion that you participate in, how much concern is being expressed about the need for subsurface containment of CO2 on the more quasi-geologic time scale, say 1,000 plus year time frame?
Steve, you bring up a very passionate point for me, that I argue the event horizon of 1,000 years. Let's cut that in half and call it 500. Let's cut that by a factor of 5 and call it 100. And my answer is, I'm asking, it's a rhetorical question. I want somebody to tell me, let me pause. Let's say we put CO2 in the ground in whatever jurisdiction, we're say we're in the United States. It's highly likely that the United States may impose some kind of financial obligation, a bond. I'm going to put a bond in place, just like when you open a mine or open a power plant. I'm going to put a bond in place so that if something goes bad or when I'm done, there's money to clean me up. So let's say I put a bond in place for putting that CO2 in the ground. I want somebody to tell me what physical company entity, what insurer, and what bond provider is going to be in business 100, 500, 1,000 years from now? The answer is they don't exist. No one can predict the future that far in advance. So I argue that when we allowed ourselves to start thinking about making commercial economic decisions, and we translated those to your comment of quasi-geologic time, we created a scenario of a no-win situation, because it's impossible for anybody, any human, to say, I can provide you some level of guarantee what will happen 1,000 years from now. We don't have a mechanism for that. That's another one of the things that fits in this bucket that I would argue for you all as geophysicists to be able to come to the table and argue. I think you all have great capabilities to enhance and provide detail and context to the statement I just made. There are people who say, oh, I want it for 1,000 years, but have no concept of what that means. And educating the people who are making those decisions, I think has great value. But to answer your question, it can't be done, in my opinion.
All right. Anonymous attendee, I really enjoyed the talk, an excellent way to bring attention to a not so easy to discuss matter. My question is regarding independent consultant. Is this an individual with certain certification, or a company can jump into this type of certification process?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. The term qualified independent consultant, geologist, engineer, was written that way for it to be vague. That allows each individual project, each individual company. The IRS decided it shouldn't decide, it shouldn't say to Oxy, if you're going to enter the program and have to do a ISO 27916 mass balance to get the 45 tax credit, the IRS was unwilling to say qualified means you passed a state PE test or a PG test. They were unwilling to say qualified means AAPG and SPE, but it doesn't mean SEG. They were unwilling to say that. So it's a long-winded rhetorical answer that says that's for you and the people who you're doing the work for to discuss, very much like an LCA. Discuss your methodology, acknowledge that you talked about, am I qualified and independent? What does qualified and independent mean to you as the person doing it? What's your relationship with the people asking you? And what does it mean for the people asking you? And if you can be comfortable, I document that in an email or a memo, put it in a file, and then go do the work. Because in order to prove the antithesis, someone's going to have to say, anonymous attendee who did the work and submitted it, that you're not independent and not qualified. And the answer is, how are you going to prove that? And that's a very vague thing that will be hard to prove.
All right. We do have a couple comments in here in terms of these are more political issues than anything else and so on. But there's a question in here in terms of how is this related to passive seismic?
It's not. And we had a joke offline before we started that there was no passive seismic in this conversation at all. But Dave, who's the director of the passive seismic group, asked me to speak. And so other than to say passive seismic is in the title, it doesn't exist today.
All right. Again, I mean, there are a lot of comments in here, but no more questions. At this point, we're at the top of the hour, actually past 6 minutes. I want to give an opportunity to whoever may have a last standing question to raise the hand and say it. And otherwise, so Ben would like to talk. So unmute yourself, Ben.
One last question is, what the last of what you said is, should we as an industry, or should the non-renewable resource industries actually start talking about storage and sequestration? Because the storage of CO2 will be critical to the development of increased utilization for special materials and for industrial recycling, particularly when you look at integrated plants systems rather than big clusters or massive scale investment projects.
Yes, I think talking is a good thing. And anytime we have an opportunity to talk about these complex issues that have definition issues, I think it's valuable. I'll take it a step further and say it's politically correct today to talk about hydrogen storage. Again, I think generically, industry is talking about something that it hasn't thought about all the details. There is going to be a storage component in hydrogen production. We're going to have to store as a carrier mechanism, CO2, hydrogen. We're going to have to put something in the ground and make sure we know where it is to be able to go get it when we need it. I think having these conversations is good. And I think these conversations are going to happen more frequently now because of the hydrogen component. So to your point, the faster that SEGs of the world can get engaged in this, the faster you all will depart your technical disciplinary content, which will be significant to the conversation. And it will allow you as individuals to become better storytellers, do those things that we've talked about, and create new opportunities for you as individuals in the industry. I'm all for it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that.
My
All
pleasure.
right. So as I said, we're past the time, but we really appreciate all your patience answering all the questions. Oh, we have apparently one more person. Oh, that was Ben, sorry. Okay, so we really appreciate your time here today, sharing your knowledge and experience, engaging into this great conversation. I want to remind everyone that this is a series, so we have monthly webinars. We'll be announcing soon our next webinar, so don't miss it on the social media. Again, Steve, thank you so much. We'll be inviting you to many other talks and programs so you can share your knowledge with us.
Annabelle, thank you. It was a pleasure. You all were a wonderful audience. It's much easier for me to do this when I have an engaged, intelligent audience, and you guys were at the top of the list. So I'll get the PowerPoint to you today so you can share with everybody, and appreciate your time today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.